Sure, sounds good. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Brownfield Grantwriting Training Webinar Series, Kickstart Your Application, by the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality and the Kansas State University Technical Assistance to Brownfield Program. Today, we'll be presenting webinar number 2, Project Area Description and Plans for Revitalization. I'm Scott Nightingale with KSU TAB, and I'll be moderating today's session. We would like to thank the Louisiana Advisory and Technical Services Bureau for sponsoring this webinar series and helping us reach municipalities across Louisiana. Talking about some logistics to begin, we will be muting everyone except for the speakers. If you'd like to ask a question at any time during this webinar, please do so by using the group chat box. Just type in your questions. We will stop periodically during the webinar to answer them. Slides from this presentation, along with a recording of the meeting, will be available on the KSU TAB website. It's very important if you're using your phone for the audio connection that you turn off your computer audio. Otherwise, there might be feedback that gets through the system for everyone to hear. Audio settings in Zoom can be set by clicking the up arrow adjacent to the mute button. Also, please note the chat button near the bottom right. This will open the box in which you can ask questions. Just as a reminder, this webinar series is focused on writing the proposal. If you would like more information about setting up a brownfield program or a general overview of the funding, KSU has a few online resources that might help. The recent On Your Mark Getting Started Early webinars provide an overview of applying for brownfield funding. The Building a Brownfield Program webinar examines the team you'll need to assemble for a successful brownfield program. Also available on the KSU TAB website is a Brownfield Basics online training program for entities planning brownfield programs. This includes information on identifying brownfields, defining the steps in the brownfield redevelopment process, and choosing appropriate strategies and tools for addressing brownfield concerns. If you're brand new to brownfields, you may want to check out these resources for information. Our speakers for today's webinar are Rebecca Otte and Danielle Getzinger. Rebecca has a passion for revitalizing vacant and abandoned properties. Building on her experience as an environmental consultant in Southern California, Rebecca managed the Brownfield Redevelopment Program at the Regional Planning Commission for the New Orleans metropolitan area for 15 years before transitioning to the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, where she currently oversees the statewide Brownfield program. She has successfully written several Brownfield assessment grant applications, as well as some unsuccessful ones, gathering a list of lessons learned and grant writing insights. Danielle Getzinger is a KSU TAB partner and the co-founder and CEO of Community Lattice, a consulting firm dedicated to overcoming environmental barriers for advancing community revitalization. She has national experience working with various local governments, nonprofits, and economic development organizations to incorporate brownfields redevelopment strategies into area-wide planning efforts. She has written several successful EPA brownfield grants and serves as a grant reviewer for KSU TAB. Ladies, please take it away.
All right. As Scott mentioned, this is the second webinar in our Brownfield Grant Writing Training Series. And today we're going to talk about the first part of your narrative proposal, the project area description, and the plans for revitalization. A few reminders before we start. We know these webinars are on the longer side. They're designed to give you a good foundation to apply for brownfield funding in the next competition. There's no getting around applying for brownfield funding. Is going to require an investment of both time and energy. But we're hoping these webinars will help you focus your time and energy as well as spread the work over a longer period of time, so it's easier to fit into your work schedule. This one is probably going to be our longest one. We might actually bump some of the information to the next webinar. It's really important to me that we answer all of your questions along the way. We really want this to be interactive and make sure that you feel comfortable with the information and feel confident moving forward. Also for this one, it is the longest one, so don't get overwhelmed with all the next steps that we have. The good news is you have plenty of time to digest the information that we're going to talk about today and start tackling those next steps before the request for application comes out. We're expecting it to come out in late August and not be due until the end of October. So you got plenty of time, and we're here to support you throughout that whole application process. Another reminder, these webinars are based on last year's requests for applications for EPA Brownfield assessment funding. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to download a copy of last year's RFA and look it over. If you've already printed them out, now's a good time, pull those out so you can mark them up with notes. The new request for applications, like I mentioned, is scheduled to come out in August, which is earlier than normal. It'll likely have some changes, but looking at last year's RFA kind of helps you get a jump start and put together the building blocks that you'll need to put together your next RFA with the new guidelines that will be coming out. And while this information in these webinars were really geared towards the assessment funding for brownfields, the general tips and insights can also relate to cleanup and multi-purpose grants if you're applying for those. Just note that the guidelines for each of those for the cleanup and the multi-purpose grants do have different requirements. So if you're interested in either one of those funding options, you might want to look back at those specific requests for applications to see what's required. And a link to all the previous requests for applications, that's included in the next steps and helpful links document. So today's webinar, we'll just do like a general overview of what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk a lot about telling your story. We're going to go over this in several different places. Then we're going to also give you an idea of who your target audience is and provide some overall tips to think about when you're preparing your application. Then we'll talk a little about the narrative ranking criteria and evaluation criteria sections of the request for applications. These are the two sections that detail out what to put in your narrative proposal. The bulk of the webinar today is going to be focused on going through part one of your application. We'll go through each section and subsection to cover what EPA is asking for in the RFA. And then we're going to give you tips on how to craft that subsection of your proposal and some data and information resources to support your application. We're going to have a short Q&A time after each subsection to answer a couple questions, and then a longer Q&A at the end just to make sure we get all your questions answered. These are the various subsections we're going to go over today. We're going to spend a lot of time on the first section, target areas and brownfields. That's what really sets the stage for the rest of your proposal, and you'll be able to use some of the data resources that we talk about there in the other sections of the applications. We'll then spend a good amount of time on the second section about revitalization plans. That last section, strategy for leveraging resources, it's a little more straightforward. It should go pretty quickly. And if it's getting close to 4 o'clock, we may actually move that one to the next webinar just to make sure we have enough time for Q&A at the end. So just wanted to make sure you didn't get overwhelmed after the first section thinking we're going to spend the same amount of time on the other two sections. We're going to go through these webinars in order of the narrative ranking criteria. Just note, you don't really have to write your proposal that way. You might want to tackle other sections first or in a different order. And it normally ends up being an iterative process as the information you put in a later section may make you revise an earlier section to match up. But hopefully through these webinars, we're at least giving you a starting point for each of the subsections. As Scott mentioned, please make sure to type your questions in the chat box so we can capture them and try to answer them by the end of the webinar. That's also going to help us determine how much time we need to leave for Q&A at the end. So please type those in as they come up. All right. So let's first talk about your narrative proposal overall. So it is really important, and like I said, we're going to mention this a lot, to tell your story and then include the facts and figures to back it up. You're going to continue to weave the story throughout the rest of your application to keep a consistent message of, why does your community have brownfield sites, the effects of those brownfields on your community, and then how will this funding improve your community as a whole. One of the mistakes I made early on was to focus on conveying the required information to the reviewer without tying it all together in one cohesive story. So when I read through the other successful proposals that are posted on the KSU tab website, I saw how they tied the various parts of the proposal together. They included the facts and figures, but they also pulled on the reviewer's heartstrings and really presented a cohesive and colorful picture of how this funding will help address the specific needs of the community. So be sure to both address the head and the heart in your proposal. And if you need some inspiration, I highly recommend reading through some of those past successful proposals as posted on KSU's website. As you'll see as we move through the guidelines, information from one section bleeds into, refers back to, and or builds on information in the other sections. So it's important to keep your story consistent throughout the proposal. And like I mentioned before, we're going to come back to this theme of telling your story throughout these presentations. All right, if you are normally a technical writer, you're going to need to put on a creative / marketing hat for this. Typically, I don't like to overpromise things, overstate things, but to be honest, that approach isn't going to win you a Brownfield grant. I like to call it aspirational reality. It's a little pie in the sky thinking, but it is based in reality. And we're going to touch on this in various places in the presentation where a little aspirational reality, creative writing might be warranted. And then once it comes out, you'll also want to read through the entire request for applications. Those are the guidelines that EPA issues that says this is what you need to include in your application for funding. It's a lot to read through, but you don't want to skip the beginning sections of the RFA. They contain little nuggets of information like EPA priorities for that year and buzzwords that you might want to include your application. For instance, last year there was a big push at EPA to use the term reuse instead of redevelopment, since some folks thought redevelopment focused too much on just buildings, and reuse was more all-encompassing to include buildings and green space and other nonprofit uses. So you just want to read through the whole RFA just to make sure you kind of see what the EPA priorities are. All right, Danielle, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Awesome. All right. To build off of what Rebecca was saying with telling your story and aspirational realities and being creative, you're really convincing the EPA that you deserve and should get their money. You're going to do really good things with it. So they want to know that they're inserting their money into a program that's already established. Now, if this is a new program for you, that's okay. You just need to be able to maybe use this as an opportunity to think about the role of Brownfield in your community and how you're going to frame up your program, and think about this as seed money for a program or money that is going into an already existing program. Either way, you need to convince the EPA that this is part of they're going to be part of something bigger. Look at the next one. And so that with the target audience, so in convincing the EPA that you have a plan, you have thought through your target area, you got to think about who is reviewing your grant proposal. For the EPA, they are going to have 3 grant reviewers read your proposal. So that's going to be somebody from Region 6 who's familiar with Brownfield, from the Brownfield office, is familiar with the nuances of potentially your program and your area of the country. You're going to have somebody else from Region 6 who might not be part of Brownfield, but they're typically part of the EPA. So somebody else from Region 6, not part of Brownfield. And then you're going to have somebody from a completely different part of the country reviewing your proposal. They will be part of Brownfield, but keep in mind that they are not going to know the nuances of your town, of your area. So you need to be very clear and don't just assume that people know what a parish is. for example, that people don't, they might not know the history of the area. They might not know what natural disasters that you've had in your town. So you have to be very, very clear and don't assume, don't use acronyms over and over again, thinking that somebody's going to pick up on it. Explain what a parish is. So that is unique to Louisiana. I had to Google it when I moved here. And then you really want to tie into, given that everybody on your review committee, and this is an EPA program, but everybody on your review committee is marching in line to the EPA strategic plan, going back to what Rebecca said about reading the entire RFA, there's a section in there that looks for alignment with the EPA strategic plan. Now, they published a strategic plan, I think it's kind of the launch of every new EPA administration, and this has very clear objectives of what they want from all of their EPA programs, and specifically from the Brownfields program. So again, to build the confidence of the EPA that you're going to do good things with their money, they want to in turn then go back to Congress and say, we did what we said we were going to do. We gave out a whole bunch of money, and they helped, all of these towns helped us get this 3,420 brownfields ready for anticipated use. So you want to give them confidence in that. I suggest you go to the EPA's website or just Google EPA strategic plan, and you'll find it. And I'm sure that Rebecca included that as a link somewhere. And if you just Control F, find brownfields, you'll see all of the different ways in which they are looking for alignment with the Brownfields program and what they want out of that.
All right, great. Thanks, Danielle. All right, so let's talk about the EPA request for applications. There are two places where EPA details what they want to see in your narrative proposal. The narrative/ranking criteria section in last year's RFA was section 4E1 that starts on page 30. And that describes what you should include in your application. And then the evaluation criteria, which was section 5A, starting on page 40 in last year's RFA for the assessment grants, talks about how the EPA reviewer will actually be awarding points. So it's really important to consider both of these sections when writing your narrative. One thing I wanted to make sure to point out, EPA's request for application, they use a numbering system to note what should be included in the narrative. Just like we talked about last week with the narrative information sheet, we highly recommend you use the same numbering system in your narrative so it's easy for the EPA reviewer to find all the information requested. Sometimes EPA asks for similar information in different sections. Make sure to include the information in each subsection where they've asked for, so that way they can award you the maximum points for that information. You don't necessarily need to include the section titles. I normally keep those in and see if I have enough space for them. But if space is starting to get tight, I tend to lose the text, but definitely keep the numbers. And speaking of space, last year's narrative proposal had a 10-page limit with a strong recommendation for standard 12-point New Times Roman, Arial, or Calibri fonts. They get very particular about that. Basically, be nice to your EPA reviewer. Try to incorporate as much white space as you can. Remember, they are human beings. They're reviewing a lot of applications in a short amount of time. And if you make it easier for them to read, it's going to be easier for them to find all the great information that you've included in your narrative. If you only have one target area, to be honest, the 10 pages should be plenty. If you have more than one target area, 2 is normally doable, 3 gets a little bit tighter. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're writing your application. So let's talk a little bit about how your proposal will be scored. Last year, applications could receive up to 150 points. And then in the evaluation criteria section of the RFA that we talked about in the last slide, it details out the points per part, section, and subsection of your proposal. So note, most reviewers are scoring based only on what you write in that particular subsection. So you might need to repeat some of the information in multiple places to make sure you get the full points for each subsection. The Brownfield competition, it's a very tight competition, so every point counts. Hopefully in these webinars we'll provide some tips to help maximize the points you receive, but you'll note that when we say this might give you 1 extra point or 2 extra points, that can make a difference. Okay, and I am hoping that we're going to have a bunch of successful proposals this year, and everyone from Louisiana who applies is awarded. However, if that is not the case, please do not give up. Sometimes it takes a couple tries to get this funding. You can request a debrief from EPA to find out where you lost points to strengthen your proposal next year. That's how I was finally successful with my application, where some of the tips that I'm going to share in these webinars come from. And just one note, if you do request that debrief, you are more than welcome to invite someone from Kansas State, from the Technical Assistance to Brownfields program, or myself at LDEQ, or anyone else you would like to participate in those debriefs with EPA, and then we can help you incorporate their suggestions in the next round. All right, so part 1 of the proposal that we're going to talk about today is the project area description and plans for revitalization. So this is where you're going to talk about your organization, your community, your overall plans for this funding, and how it fits with existing plans and efforts to revitalize your community. As we mentioned before, you're going to weave this story throughout the rest of your application. The first section of part 1 is titled Target Area and Brownfields, which is broken up into 2 subsections. The first subsection is the background and description of the target area. It's like the opening paragraph of your short story, where you want to hook the reader in and help them connect with your Brownfield program. So the key questions to answer in this section are, what is your target area? What makes it unique? What's the link to Brownfields? And who are you? Who's the person that's applying, or the organization that's applying? So Danielle, would you like to go over the writing approach?
Sure do. So the writing approach, if you open up the RFA, if you actually have it in front of you, you'll see, and I don't actually have the page numbers on here, but we can help you out later with that. There is the ranking criteria that you're going through. And after that ranking criteria, the RFA actually explains the evaluation criteria. So what do those 3 reviewers that I was just discussing, what are they scoring your descriptions on? What are they scoring your grant on? So I recommend that you write this with that ranking criteria and the evaluation criteria side by side. And we've broken this down based on the way that we understand it, and the way that, but there could be a different approach if your take on it. So the way that we would recommend is, if you read it verbatim, the ranking criteria is to include a brief description of your city, town, or geographic area to provide background on the cultural and industrial history. That is coming back to tell your story, hook 'em, like Rebecca said. This is opening paragraph. What's going on? Who are you? And then that establishes the industrial history that establishes your Brownfields challenges. Now they're looking for the extent to which you describe the context of why did you get all these Brownfields? How did it happen? What went wrong? That's what they're judging you on. So make sure that that link is really clear. Then the impact on the community. How did those Brownfields affect the community? We just put a note here. This introduces just the community impacts, and that should be carried through your entire proposal. Now, somebody in the beginning asked about prioritization criteria and how do you select priority sites. Some of this is your way of selecting priority sites as your community need. If you're saying that there's a lot of job loss because of the brownfield sites, there's a lot of unsafe conditions, blight, whatever, those start to become your way of evaluating your priorities of what you want to address first and what those outcomes look like. So if you're talking about job loss, you're going to want to tie that all the way through. Also noting back to those 3 reviewers, those 3 reviewers have their own set of priorities in their mind based on their experience with EPA in their region. So the reviewers that are outside of your region might have a different priority, say in Nebraska, than they do in Louisiana. So I would recommend having a few themes just to try to capture, and some of those popular themes of jobs, and there's economic development is always a big one, affordable housing and things of that nature. Hit on a few of them to try to capture a wider range of those priorities. And then you're going to go into identifying and describing the specific target areas where you plan to perform the assessment activities, such as the neighborhoods, districts, and corridors. So we're going to go over this in a little bit more detail, but they're looking for the extent to which you are very specific about that target area. It's really well defined, and we will go into those tips. So as you're writing this, make sure that you're checking yourself, going back down through this box and tearing this apart however you want to make sure that you're hitting everything that they are evaluating you on.
All right.
Okay, right back here.
All right, so as Danielle just mentioned, the first step in really putting together an application for Brownfield funding is defining your target area. So that way you're gonna have the information you need to help tell your story. So your target area is where you plan to focus your Brownfield efforts on. This can be as big or as small as you would like. Some examples from previous proposals include downtown development districts, Main Street corridors, entire small towns. Some folks have done transportation corridors or key intersections, you know, with a 1 mile buffer zone around. You could do a neighborhood or group of neighborhoods, or even a census tract or set of census tracts. This map is an example. We partnered with the Port of New Orleans to focus on properties within a 1 mile radius of the Inner Harbor Navigational Canal. So that green little buffer zone, that was our target area. So in the first part of the proposal, you want to clearly state your target area or areas. I recommend you give them a name and then bold that name so that it sticks in the reviewer's mind. You'll also want to clearly define, as Danielle mentioned, the geographic boundaries of your target area. But just a note, don't include a map. They don't like maps or photos or anything in the proposal. That's just for demonstration. You can choose more than one target area, but remember that you're going to need to describe each of them. That's going to require more space in your application. I'd recommend keeping it to 1 or 2 target areas. That normally works best. One tip on this, think about choosing a geography where you can clearly find demographic and health data. For instance, if you choose a corridor approach, you may want to line up the boundaries of your target area with the census tracts to more easily access the demographic data through the census. If you choose a small town, that, you know, your target area might be 80% of the small town, you might want to just extend it out to the whole 100% to make it easy to gather that information. You also want to check the new guidance when it comes out to see if there are any particular focus areas in the request for applications. For example, we expect that opportunity zones might be a focus again this year. Last year, they were big on sites that were adjacent to water bodies. You never know what kind of priorities there might be that year. So while it helps if your target area overlaps with EPA's priority, it's really more important that it works for your community, so don't force it. But if there is a way, let's say that it's adjacent to an opportunity zone, you might think about expanding your target area to include that opportunity zone or area that, that EPA is prioritizing that year. Okay, so one of the things we found out as we were putting this webinar together is people choose their target areas in different ways. So Danielle, do you want to talk about option 1?
Sure, yeah, and there's really no wrong way to choose a target area, but we'll go over some selection criteria next. So one option is really more of a municipal. We see it a lot with municipalities, where you start with your plans and your data to drive you. So you're bringing up revitalization strategies, city master plans, and looking at environmental justice indicators, and you're selecting your target area based off of what where the city or the town or the regional government where it wants to focus. So you might be selecting one area of town based off of the fact that you got other funding for that area, and it becomes a priority for the city to support revitalization. And then from there, you can select priority sites that might align with that revitalization plan. In my experience, this option is used by a lot of big cities, but it's also used to give flexibility of inserting brownfield funding into kind of an incentive package for development. And Rebecca has other options that she's used.
Okay, so I kind of take a different approach. I think this came from managing the Brownfield program for years and always trying to come up with sites. So I start with my priority sites, so that way I have projects to complete once I get the funding. So I start identifying my priority sites, and then I build my target area around those sites, and then look for plans and data that are available for that area. So this is where Kansas State's, their Brownfield inventory tool can help you develop a database of potential Brownfield sites and then identify clusters that might work well as target areas. And there's a link to the Brownfield inventory tool as well as a tutorial on how to use it in the next steps and helpful links document. Or to be honest, a lot of times when I'm doing my grant application, I just use an Excel spreadsheet for this. And we gave you, I sent out example Excel spreadsheets for to give you a starting place. You could also do a table in Word. And it's helpful to include information like your site name, your address, current and former uses, potential environmental concerns, that type of information, so you have it to refer back to later on. So whichever one you take, either starting with the plans and data to do the target area to find your priority sites, or starting with priority sites to choose your target area, and then look for plans and data to go along with that. You want to make sure, again, think about being able to tell the story of that target area throughout your application. And as Danielle mentioned, you know, does this target area have a compelling story to tell? All right, Danielle, would you like to go over a little on the target area selection? Danielle, are you still there?
Yeah, you can't hear me when I'm on round
There
two.
we go.
So the target area selection, no matter how you approach it, at the end, you want to make sure that there's an alignment with the community revitalization plans and other public incentives, like opportunity zones, enterprise zones. You might have designated zones from your city that are designated by the mayor's office or city council or town council. You want to, again, align with the EPA's strategic plan objectives, so search through that. There's going to be demographic information that is going to be really important. We'll get into it in later sections, but going back to what the EPA is looking for, they're not necessarily looking for you to use brownfield funding on a wealthy part of town. They're looking for how do we improve areas of town or provide opportunities for those vulnerable populations. This is very much rooted in environmental justice. So how have those brownfields affected those communities, and how can we fix that through brownfields redevelopment? So, you know, we do want to make sure that your target area contains brownfields. I've been known to be able to spin just about any property into a brownfield site, but you want to make sure that there's a compelling argument there and there's an actual need for brownfields redevelopment. And then you want to align with the grant guidelines, again, going back through and looking for those buzzwords. Persistent poverty has been used as a buzzword quite often. Public health disparities, sensitive populations. You want to make sure that you're aligning and checking the boxes of what the EPA is really looking for and some of those buzzwords that they're using. And actually, I can answer one of the questions that just popped up. I think it's a good time for that in this context of when you would want to define one target area versus two. If there's a larger target area that might contain multiple sites, or if you want to separate those out, I would recommend separating those out based off of the demographics and the story behind those two areas. If that area, even if it's a larger area, shares the same story, shares the same community revitalization plans, the same commitment to revitalizing the brownfields, is going to share the same benefits and the same kind of impact, you can have a larger area. But it might be more compelling to tell two separate stories based off of two separate experiences, if that makes sense. And we can revisit that again.
Okay. Thanks, Danielle. So in your application, you just want to make sure you state why you're choosing your particular target area, referring some of the topics that Danielle touched on, naming the community revitalization plans, actually name them out in the section, stating that it aligns with EPA's strategic plan objectives, and talking specifically about how this grant is going to address persistent poverty-sensitive populations in your target area. And you also want to incorporate how you actually selected this target area in the grant narrative, and especially how the community was involved in the process. EPA, big priority to involve the community in brownfields. So that's something that you want to mention throughout your application. All right, the next steps are to either start making a list of the brownfield sites in your community, and then based off of that, choose your target areas, and then research plans and data that go along with that target area, or research the plans and data that you already have available, choose your target area based off of those, and then make a list of the brownfield sites in your community. So these are just kind of two ways of kind of approaching how to find your target area. Since we're early in the process, it might be good to select 3 or 4 different target areas and see which ones fit best when you're writing the rest of your proposal, and then narrow it down to 1 or 2 later on. Just another tip, you also might want to check with your organization about who needs to sign off on your target area, or if there are any political considerations that you might need to think about as part of the process overall. Okay, so once you have your target area or areas selected, it's time to start telling your story. So most brownfield target areas were once thriving communities. Then they hit a rough patch, which then resulted in the creation of brownfield sites. And now you're trying to create the reuse of those brownfields to help address specific health, social, and economic needs. So this is the section where you're going to talk about the great place your community once was, what tragedy happened to change that, and specifically how did that create brownfield sites in your community, and then how this funding is going to help restore it to a more sustainable and resilient version of its former glory. So as you can guess from my tone, when you're writing this section, you'll definitely want your creative writing hat on. You'll also want to include information about what makes your community unique. What's going to make your proposal stand out from the other ones? I think I saw someone's the buggy capital of Louisiana. Some people include specific ethnic groups such as Cajuns or Islanos that are in their target area might be affected. You just want to kind of note what makes your culture and society special. You'll also want to touch on your economic drivers and your challenges. So what industries once fueled your economy? Did you have a manufacturing facility that closed down? Do you have abandoned gas stations along the local highway that have been vacant since the interstate was built and destroyed your hospitality industry? Did racial segregation cause disinvestment in your target area? For Louisiana, you can definitely note the downturn in the oil and gas industry that has impacted budgets of all levels of government and local businesses. You'll probably want to note COVID-19 and its impact on your economy, especially if your area is heavily dependent on the hospitality industry. let's be honest, the sites were brownfields well before the pandemic. So you just want to make sure to state, you know, what occurred in your target area that resulted in the economic downturn. So go back as far as you need to paint that picture of your economic/social downturn. One tip for this, you don't want to just say that your target area has brownfield sites and leave it like that. You want to give it a little color, a little description. You want to talk about what kinds of brownfields you have. Do you have gas stations, industrial sites, historic properties with lead and asbestos? Do you have meth labs? You'll include a lot more detail about the sites later in the application. In this first part, you don't have to include a ton of detail, but just some color to it. So you're painting a bigger picture for the reviewer. So for instance, instead of just saying we have 70 brownfield sites in our target area, you could say we have 70 brownfield sites, including abandoned gas stations, vacant dry cleaners, and manufacturing facilities. So just kind of flesh that out a little bit. All right, Danielle, would you like to talk about who's applying?
Sure. Yeah. One of the things that people often overlook in this section is telling the reviewer a bit about who is applying. So what is the name of your organization? What is the role of redevelopment program in your community? Again, this is where you build that confidence that you have a program and that program is active in the community, even if it's in some initial stages. How have you been involved with past Brownfield grants? If you have, is this an extension of another program or at your organization, or do you plan to put together, or a plan you were to put together as you were part of? This doesn't need to be extensive, 1 or 2 sentences, and hopefully after the previous webinar, you've thought through whether you're going to be applying on your own or as a coalition. So if you choose to apply as a coalition, note your coalition members in this section and their role that they're going to play as part of this Brownfields grant. Again, this does not need to be extensive. You could say our coalition is going to include cities A, B, and C, which comprise our target area. City A will oversee the Brownfields program to ensure that the EPA requirements are met, for example. And then representatives from cities A and B and C will also serve on a Brownfields committee. So really understand what are the roles and how is that coalition going to work together. Give the EPA confidence that that coalition has thought through their teaming arrangement to give the EPA confidence that they're inserting their money into a well-organized program. Another tip in this section, along with bolding the names of your target area in this first part, we recommend that you bold your organization, if applicable, the coalition members' names so that they stand out. Bolding is a great tip just in general to be able to pop out certain facts that you want the reviewer to see. So they're going to be looking at a lot of proposals in general, so make their life a little bit easier there.
Yeah, I had a reviewer once where I stated, at the time I was at the Regional Planning Commission, obviously stated that in this first section, and then stated it again on like page 7 or 8, talked about the Regional Planning Commission's role, and the reviewer's comment was, who is the Regional Planning Commission and what are they doing? So that's why we're kind of emphasizing that, to bold it, just to make sure that it stands out in the reviewer's mind. So you'll also want to include some demographic information throughout your proposal, including this first part. Last year's EPA guidelines, that was the first year they didn't require that you actually include a demographic table like they did previously, but personally, I found it's really helpful to put a table together in Excel or Word for easy reference throughout the grant writing process. It does take time to pull this information together, and I'm normally adding to the table as I move through the application and realize I need another bit of information. So this is something that I really recommend you start early to start gathering this demographic information. Example demographics include population, percent minority, poverty rates, unemployment rates, average housing cost, and statistics related to income. So you'll want demographic information for your target area, for the city parish that it's located in, the state, and the US. So this allows you to compare the data for your target area to other geographies to show your need. It's also really helpful to know what census tracts comprise your target area. So we've included a link to the census tract maps in the Next Steps and Helpful Links document, or you might just try Googling it, which might be a little bit easier. Demographics can also help you choose your target area, as Danielle mentioned earlier. Last year's guidelines specifically stated that EPA's Brownfield program has a rich history rooted in environmental justice. So in order to be competitive, it's really helpful if your target area or areas include environmental justice communities and or sensitive populations. Resources for finding demographic information include the US Census and the Department of Labor. In the next few slides, we're going to go over the census website to provide some tips on gathering information that's relevant to this first part of your application. And while there does have the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I got to be honest, most of the information that I've used just comes from the US Census, and I've been able to find everything that I needed there. All right, so major tip for this section. This was one of the best things I found out at an EPA grant writing workshop. Louisiana actually has a state demographer who can help in pulling this information from the US Census resources. So basically, I sent her this Excel table noting the geographies that I'm looking for down the left-hand column, including the census tracts, that's key, and then the various characteristics I'm looking for across the top. And then she, about a week later, sends me back a completed table. It has gotten easier to find information on the US Census website, but while she was putting together this information, I was able to concentrate on writing the rest of the proposal. And to be honest, she could do this a lot quicker than I could. Since we're making these webinars available to others, I didn't want to post her contact information on this, but if you would like it, please email me and I will send it over to you. You can also check with local resources for data. Danielle, do you want to talk a little bit more about this?
Sure, the local resources. So especially in smaller towns too, the local tax assessor office has, or just the city in general, they'll have a potentially a blighted property database, maybe a tax delinquent database, and it could just be an Excel file that somebody keeps on their desktop. So calling around for that information is often really helpful. Bigger cities will, or more sophisticated data forward cities will post that online. There are crime databases that are often at a regional level that you can look at. Google Earth Pro, I'm a big fan of Google Earth Pro, really specifically for their toggle back in time of aerial photographs. You can get some really interesting just feel for what was going on, and you can actually see in some areas and then vacant land. The USPS actually has a database that is designed in collaboration with HUD to find vacancy rates or to find vacant properties or abandoned properties. So every time that there is a letter or a package that cannot be delivered multiple times to an address, and there's indication that that address is vacant, it goes into this database so that HUD can track it. Then there's the local health department. A lot of health departments they're tracking data all the time. Either your state health department or local health department, they have cancer studies that they've been doing. Their epidemiologists are constantly studying the populations, especially vulnerable populations, and they're pretty active right now. They have things like lead levels in children. They have rates of diabetes and other community health concerns and disparities within those communities that are indications of environmental injustice. So I would recommend that you definitely talk to the health departments.
All right. And then just one other note, you're also going to use this information in the community needs section. So while you're in the weeds with the US Census information, you may also want to pull out some extra data that might be useful in that section as well. All right, so exploring the census data, it can be helpful. Sometimes it can get a little frustrating. So we're gonna just walk through an example to help demystify this. Keep in mind that you only need data that's useful to your proposal. You'll probably pull more information than you need, but try not to get so distracted by all the available data that you lose sight of what data is gonna substantiate your request for funding. This walkthrough, it comes with the caveat, this is my way of getting to the data using the new census website. There might be other tutorials out there with a better way, or someone in your office who can help with this and get it done in a fraction of the time. But if you have to do it yourself, I thought it was worth going through an example just so it's not as intimidating. So this is the main US Census website. When you hover over the Explore Data tab, you want to select on Explore Data Main. And this is the search box. I have to say, I was a little skeptical about this, but it actually works pretty well if you know what you're looking for. So a good place to start for a Brownfield application is poverty with the name of your geographic area. And here are the results when I search for poverty in Jefferson Parish. It comes up with general numbers at the top and then a more detailed table in the middle. You want to note the scroll bars that will help you find additional information and the related searches on the right that are quick links to other data for that geography that might be helpful in your application. All right, there's also a View All Tables button at the bottom, which is going to get you here. This is a good resource to see what other data might be available that relates back to your application. So you can also customize this table by using the button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can filter and download the data with the links in the upper left-hand corner. Just kind of be warned, when I was working on this, I found that the back button often sent me back to the original search screen and I lost what I was working on. So if there's information you think you're going to need, make sure to capture it before hitting that back button. The second way of accessing the data is to go to click on go to data.census.gov, which is going to take you here, and we're going to highlight the advanced search feature. Under advanced search, you can choose the various filters or categories you want to show up in your table. So if you click on the topics in the far left up here, a list of topics such as business and economy and employment show up. If you click on one of those topics such as income and poverty, you'll get another list, this one over here, where you can click on the information you're looking for. In this example, let's look at the income and poverty data. Next, you'll want to click on the geography section to select the geographic areas you would like to get information for. The first selection you'll make is how big or small an area you want to look at. Then you'll work your way through the specific geography, including the state, and then the county and parish, and so on. And in this example, I selected 2 census tracts that correspond with my theoretical target area. At this point, you can click on the search button in the bottom right, and it'll come up with the information. But if you want to keep going, just to show you the different filters, you can also, under years, select what years you want the data for. Usually it's best to select the most recent data, but note that not all data is collected every year. You might want to select different years also if you want to show like a decrease in population or an increase in the number of people living below poverty. You might want that information as well. You can also search which survey you would like information from. Note you don't have to select anything here, and normally it's limited by what information you've already selected in the other filters. Then there's also an option to search by various codes. Honestly, I don't really use this tab. So note as you select the various filters, they're going to show up at the bottom of the screen. If you want to remove a particular filter, you can click on the X to take that filter off. So I encourage you to take a little time, play around with this, see what filters you need and which ones you don't to get that information for your proposal. So once you're done selecting your filters, again, you want to hit that search button on the bottom right corner. And this is what's going to pop up after you hit the search button. Note the links in the upper left-hand corner, and if you click on tables, you're going to get to this page where you can see the data in table format. So notice in the upper left-hand corner, the download button. I found it really useful to download the information in Excel so I can copy and paste it into my demographic table and have the information to refer back to later on without having to go through this process again. Again, this is just kind of a general overview to help demystify gathering data from the census. Remember, you only need data that's relevant to your proposal. I normally write the proposal and then use placeholders for some of the numbers to figure out what data I need to collect. Then I pull the data that I need and then kind of see if there's any other categories that might be helpful to my application and kind of go back and forth. So your next step from the slide, spend 15, 20 minutes just exploring the US website, the census website. Look through the various data they have, think about what might be useful for your application. Just get comfortable with searching the site for information. Found it's really a lot easier to use this website when I don't have an impending grant deadline. So now is a really good time just to play with it, get used to it before the request for application actually comes out. All right, Danielle, would you like to go over EPA's EJ screen?
Yeah, I sure would. Do you want me to share my my desktop to go over this? Or do you want to do that at the Q&A?
Hold on just a second. I'm going to stop sharing and you can share your screen.
Okay.
Okay.
So one of the things that I meant to mention earlier is that you want to ground truth this data into your community, into the community outreach that you're doing. The census data is recently gotten something in the mail and it relies on you sending that survey back to the government. There's a lot of bias in this data. So you're going to need to make sure that if the data is telling a specific story, ground truth it. Definitely go out to the community, ask community members, community leaders, or other government programs, is this actually reflected? Are the poverty levels that we're seeing in the data reflected in what's the experience of the community? Another method for looking at this EJ screen tool is a fantastic tool. I highly recommend that you go through and just play with it, look at tutorials. One of the features that I really like to use is if you go into this, select location, select a location. Oh, it closed it. Select a location, and then you can click on various ways that you're going to define a location. Let's say we're going around Rebecca's project here at the port. You can capture it. I don't know if this is actually your target area, Rebecca, but I think it's fairly close to it.
That's pretty good.
There you go. If you are in a spot where you don't necessarily have a well-defined target area based on census tracts or something that is clean, you can do this little tool and then you can export all of this data. So here's that census report. And of course, my internet's now going to be slow because we're live. But it gives you all of the data in a table format. You might need to go back into the census data, the U.S. Census, to refine some of those numbers or add to those numbers. But it gives you a really good snapshot of what the EPA is looking for. And I saw a question pop up from Trey about what defines an environmental justice community and what resonates with the EPA. Is really based off of the indicators of environmental justice, and that includes sensitive populations. So that comes out in the data with percent minority, low income, other indicators that you can go on their website and find exactly what they're looking for. But you're looking for high percentiles. You're looking for above average and skewed data here. So, percent minority here is 86%. And this will tell you all of that demographic information, but if you also go into some other reports, you can see this by their environmental justice indicators, the proximity to, their risk relative to ozone, lead-based paint, wastewater discharge. So these are the certain things that the EPA is tracking. And if there are trends in these areas that you're in their target areas, you definitely want to note that as you go into your report. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing.
All right.
Rebecca.
Yeah, that's such a great resource. I wish I had known a little bit more about that when I was putting together previous proposals. A great way to get that information very quickly. Also, if you do use it, make sure you note that in your application. EPA always likes it when you use their tools, so that's a good thing to note. And another answer on the sensitive populations, we're actually going to go into that in quite a bit of detail in webinar number 3 when we're talking about the community need. Okay, so just to make sure, can y'all see my screen, Danielle? Can you see it?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Let's see. All right. Also, EJ screen can also help you in selecting target areas, just kind of giving you ideas on where your boundaries might need to be in order to make a more compelling story. And as Danielle mentioned, the next step for this slide, just spend 15 minutes exploring EJ screen for your area, getting used to it, seeing what data is available and how to access that. And we've also included a link to some additional tutorials to better navigate all the data. They're in the next steps and useful links document. All right. Danielle, I think you covered some of these already.
Yeah, I did. I got a little bit ahead of myself, but it's good. Here's a list in front of you of all of the other databases. And again, going back to grounding things into the community and calling up, the health department and other local, partners to really understand what the data means and to ground truth is really important.
Yeah, and like Danielle mentioned before, you really want to see what's higher in your target area for these. So, did your target area have higher levels of COVID than other surrounding communities or in the US? Do you have a higher diabetes or obesity rate? You want to really note like higher crime rates, more blighted properties. You want to note why your community needs this more than any other community. A couple other community sources that are out there. We're going to cover these more in the community needs section part of the application in the next webinar. We're just kind of noting them now as some of this information might relate back to your project description. Louisiana Department of Health, really good resource for data and information. For instance, they have information on the rate of low birth weights. Fetal development could be impacted by lead exposure. Lead exposure might come from your brownfield sites that had lead-based paint that's now flaking off. So that's kind of how you can wrap that together. Louisiana Tumor Registry, they provide information on cancer statistics. This was a source I showed to show the elevated mesothelioma rate in my target area, which could be caused by the asbestos exposure from my brownfield sites that had asbestos in them. The U.S. Energy Information Administration, they can provide information on the drop in oil prices, which can show economic need. So you can say, the drop in oil prices resulted in tax revenue loss, which then limits the funding available to address brownfields. It may have also caused the decline in your target area as oil-related industries shut down, and then caused a ripple effect on support businesses like local suppliers and restaurants. Like, this is the demise of your community part, and the U.S. Energy Information, you can provide some statistics to back that up. So remember, make sure to relate it all back to brownfields. How did this information, these health effects, how are they being exasperated by your brownfield sites? A tip for this section, I got to be honest, when I'm pulling together data and information and I need this little piece of information, a lot of times I'll use a search engine to find that data. So example, searching for lead level in children in Louisiana. Just make sure that when you get the results, you're pulling from a reputable source. And if it comes up in Wikipedia, that's okay, but please don't cite Wikipedia in your proposal. That's kind of a red flag for EPA. Make sure you kind of, filter through the Wikipedia page, find out what they're using as a resource, double check that resource to make sure the data is good, and then cite that as a source instead of Wikipedia. Your next step from the slide, just make a list of some of the data resources that might be helpful for your particular target area. Do a little digging, make note of websites, reports where you found the information for future reference. And you might also want to just put a pin in this and wait until we tackle the community needs section, because you'll really get into it there, and then you can tie it back into your project description. Okay, I learned best through examples. So I thought we would do kind of an example of how to tell your story and kind of what we're talking about for this section. So this is from the LDEQ revolving loan fund proposal that I wrote last year, so I could cut and paste with abandon. Note, it starts with some flowery language in the front. Louisiana's rich cultural tapestry woven along the Mississippi River Basin, like really trying to pull them in. It also includes information on how our economy has been affected by flooding and by the economic fluctuations of the oil and gas market. Then it talks about how those economic issues and climate change issues created brownfields and what types of brownfields. And then, kind of pulling it all together includes the hope for a better tomorrow if only this funding is awarded. So that's the opening paragraph. In the second paragraph, it specifically states who's applying for the funding and what kind of funding we're applying for. It also leads into the target area description, talks about how those sites were chosen, and we make sure to note that community input. Again, don't put it in red. We're just doing that for highlighting it on these webinars. And again, notice, put in opportunity zones every chance I could get. And then finally, for each target area, we put together a description, including relevant demographic information on that area's brownfield sites and that specific target area's economic struggles. You could throw in some health information, crime statistics, whatever you think would be relevant to demonstrate how brownfields negatively impacted your community. But again, you want to make sure you're still telling your story. Like in the early 1900s, the expansion of rail and manufacturing really built up this industry. But then those moved out, and now they've created these brownfield sites that was exacerbated by the rains. And now we have these target areas that we want to address and bring back to life. Remember, include data references either in the text or in the footnotes. Did you get it from the US Census? Did you get it from the Bureau of Labor Statistics? I got to be honest, I kind of abandoned English class rules. I normally play with this. Some of them are in the text, some of them are in footnotes, depending on how it works out with the spacing, but just make sure to include those references. All right, Danielle, would you like to give a summary?
Sure do. Yeah, and we've gone over quite a bit, so just want to capture kind of some themes that we've gone over. I think that the biggest one here is really telling that story. And statistics, remember the statistics are going to be the same everywhere around the country, especially in environmental justice communities. But the stories are what set your community apart. The experiences that the community might have an unemployment rate of 10% or something like that. But what is that experience? So how did that actually affect people in the community? Tug on those heartstrings. Don't forget to mention who you are. And to select the target area based on the revitalization plans, community need, and the EPA evaluation criteria. and clearly define that target area geographically. So we're looking for, you know, the interstate to the north and the river to the south, or census tracts 1, 2, and 3, or zip code X. Clearly define that. So if your reviewer is, for instance, picking up a map, they can say, oh, right here is clearly defined.
Yeah, that's really one of the keys, and really painting that initial picture of where you want to focus this, this funding. Okay. So let's kind of go over the next steps that we talked about. Note, we're not giving you, these aren't a strict order. They're just kind of starting places. As we mentioned before, some people start with sites and then choose their target areas. Some people look at plans and demographics to choose their target areas and then develop a list of brownfield sites. So don't feel like you have to go these in order. It's just kind of giving you an idea of places to start. So things you want to think about moving forward, choose 1 or 2 target areas, maybe a couple of backups just in case. Start your brownfields inventory, you know, think about names and locations of your sites, potential contaminants. You can do this with KSU's brownfield inventory tool, or using Excel, Word, or another program to keep track of that information. Research plans and studies already conducted in your target area, or research plans in your geographic area and help determine your target areas. And then start your target area demographic table, looking at the US Census website and the EJ Screen websites, and then see what other information might support your application. And then definitely you want to make sure you're putting on your marketing hat for this. You want to describe your target area, you know, think about what makes it unique, what are its overall economic and social issues, why are brownfields an issue, and what kind of brownfields do you have, and why are you choosing that particular area. And then, as Danielle mentioned, make sure to describe your entity and your coalition members if applicable, and what's your role in redeveloping brownfield sites. A lot of folks who are applying for this funding, you know, this is one part of an overreaching program. So you kind of want to describe to EPA, this is what we're trying to accomplish, and this brownfield funding will help us get to that goal. All right. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to do a quick poll, and then we're going to run into some, have some time for questions and answers. So if you want to go ahead, we're going to ask you, you know, have you defined your target area yet? So we kind of went over target areas in detail. We just want to know where people are with selecting their target area. If you already know the exact boundaries of your area, that's great. If you're just starting to think about it, that's fine too. If you're other, you can type those details into the chat box. Remember, you got plenty of time to figure this out. So if you're just getting started, that's okay. Also, as a reminder, type those questions into the chat box, and we'll have a pause for questions and answers after the poll.
We still have some votes trickling in. We'll leave it up about 10 more seconds.
All right. All right. So it looks like we got about almost 20% that know exactly where they want to focus their brownfield program. About 24% both for, we have some options in narrowing them down, or have a general geographic area but nothing defined. Couple folks don't know yet, but they have some ideas. And then about 30% that are just getting started. That's great. Now is a wonderful time to just get started on this and start thinking about what might work well for your target area. All right. Now we're going to take a pause for questions. We do know that these are a little bit on the longer side, so we also encourage you to stretch during this time. So big stretch up to the sky, out to the side, maybe stand up a little bit, just to make sure to get the blood flowing throughout this. And Scott, were there any questions that came in that we needed to answer?
Steve, most of them have been covered as we go. I had one for you. You talk about kind of narrowing target areas down to one or two. How does that work when it's a coalition application? How do you adjust the numbers then?
I think it definitely requires something where you need to talk with your other coalition members to make sure everyone's on board. Sometimes if you have coalition members that each are separate geographies, like let's say there's 3 towns that are coming together, you want to make sure you have a target area in each of those towns. For example, the city of Monroe, the city of West Monroe and Washita Parish put together a coalition grant application. Their target areas were the historic downtown of Monroe along the river, the historic downtown of West Monroe, also on the river, and then some rural sites that were in Washita Parish. So that's one example where you could kind of separate them out. Another example, though, is like our coalition grant that's between LDEQ, the Port of New Orleans, and the Regional Planning Commission. Those 3 all have overlapping jurisdictions, so not jurisdictions, but geographies. So we were all able to come just on one target area of sites that were along the industrial canal. That includes, obviously, LDEQ, we cover the whole state. The Regional Planning Commission, one of their member parishes is the city of New Orleans. And then the Port of New Orleans owns quite a bit of property along the industrial canal. So that was one where we could kind of focus it down in that area. But you want to think about, like Danielle mentioned, what are some areas that can that will have a compelling story to tell, and where do you really want to focus your efforts? Where do you want to see revitalization happen? And if you invest in a few priority sites, where's there some momentum for further revitalization? All right, any other questions before we move on? All right, let's go on for the next section. All right. The second subsection of the target area and brownfield section, you're going to go into more detail about your priority sites. So Danielle, would you like to go over the writing approach for this section?
I do. So again, we're going to do the same writing approach where you're looking at the ranking criteria and the evaluation criteria. So we're describing the actual brownfield sites in the target area, highlight one or more sites that are a priority. And you'll see a theme here. They're going to say the degree to which your brownfield sites in the target area are described. It's a little bit subjective, but I think you get a feel for that they want this to be explained well. And discuss why the sites, why these sites are a priority for assessment and reuse. So the degree to which it is clear why the sites are identified as a priority for the community, and tie that back to the need for the community in the revitalization plans. Don't mention that this is a priority to create jobs if you haven't mentioned above the unemployment rates and the goals for job creation. Include information such as past and current land use, current site conditions, and potentially related environmental issues. So this is the extent to which the description of priority brownfield sites provides clear information on the past and current land use, the current site conditions, and the potentially related environmental issues. So really we're grounding that in why is this a brownfield site or potentially a brownfield site, and why is this an issue? So we're looking for a lot of information in that last bullet there.
All right, great. So in the first subsection, you talked about how you ended up with brownfield sites in the first place. And you mentioned like how many, what kind of brownfield sites are in your target area in general. In the second subsection, you're going to go into more detail about your priority sites. In theory, these are the sites you're going to focus on when you get the funding. In reality, though, let's talk reality. It's a year between when you apply for the funding and when the grant would start. So these may not be the same sites you want to work on. That's perfectly okay. You know, just do the best you can. The priority sites in your proposal should have a compelling story to tell and should help you market your Brownfield program to EPA. So you want to think about sites that have a significant past, a checkered past, those work well. So you kind of want to look at your Brownfield site inventory, see what sites might help you craft that story. So do you have some that a significant historical event happened there? You know, was it the first Coca-Cola bottling company in the state? Was it the last car dealership to close? Is it a motel that may have had a checkered past that now you want to get rid of so you could put in artist lofts? You know, you want to kind of think through that story. So normally I start off with maybe 15 or 20 sites, and then I whittle that down to maybe 3 to 5 priority sites of which ones can really help me bring that story together. Note, EPA, the guidance, it says such as, but it's really specifically asking for you to include the past and current land uses, the current site conditions, the potentially related environmental issues. And then you also kind of want to make sure you state how the site was identified as a priority by the community. Again, EPA, very big on community involvement. You want to pepper that throughout your application. This can be through your visioning process. It can be through a partner's community outreach efforts. You know, if the local parish or municipality developed a revitalization plan, zoning document, something like that, and they did community outreach with that and identified the site, you can cite that as well. You also want to kind of include information on the plans for redevelopment. So, you know, you want to talk about maybe if a developer is actually interested in the site, if it's included in a revitalization or economic redevelopment plan, and or if, you know, there's a community group that's, you know, the friends of, you know, this particular school that is really behind the site. You want to try to keep it consistent with the first subsection. You know, how is each priority site impacted by the economic and cultural and climate and other challenges that you stated in the background section. You want to be sure to include all the information for each priority site in the subsection. So it makes it really easy for EPA to check all those boxes, you know, the past and current land uses, current site conditions, potentially related environmental issues, to award you the full amount of points. So Danielle, do you have any tips on kind of choosing your wish list of brownfield sites?
Yeah, I mean, to reiterate a lot of what you just said, it's really choosing that wish list. And even if it's a bit of a stretch, and even if you might not be able to acquire or be part of a redevelopment of some iconic buildings downtown, if it's a good story and it aligns with your program, put it in there. You never know, you might be able to be part of it. Tell the stories. And if it is mentioned in a revitalization plan, Rebecca said this a moment ago, but I want to emphasize it. If it is literally listed as the community sees this this old hospital building as a potential catalyst for a cultural arts district because of a historic preservation and opportunity for artist lofts. That is an awesome, awesome story. The EPA is looking for things like that. They're looking for properties that are going to then leverage more funding, more economic development, HUD funding, EDA funding, NEA funding, that's National Endowment for the Arts, economic development. You get the picture. You want the stories that tell a really good story. I mean, the properties that tell a really good story.
Great. All right, so again, I'd be better with examples. So let's go through an example of how to do this. Again, just one way of putting this information together, and it's helpful to give you an idea of what to include. I really encourage you to look through the other proposals on KSU's website for additional inspiration on what to include in this section. I like tables, as you'll discover through this webinar series, so I choose to put the site information in table format. You can put it in a paragraph or a bullet point form, whatever works for you. So in this opening paragraph, states how the priority sites were chosen. You know, made sure to note the community input. And this was one of 3 of the sections for my proposal, so 1 for each of the target areas. So I put the name of my target area at the top, noted that it was an opportunity zone, since that was a really high priority for EPA in the last RFA. Okay, then I stated the name of the site. You can just use the address if it doesn't have a name. You can also use a group of sites like 10 gas stations along Jefferson Highway. I also like to note the size of the site. It helps give reviewer a better picture of the site and helps them understand how you're going to be spending this money that you're awarded. So if you've got, you know, 5 priority sites that are all 100 acres, they're probably going to be thinking, okay, this probably isn't enough money to address that many sites. But if you have, you know, 2 sites that are both half an acre, they're going to think, well, that's not enough. So you kind of want that happy medium of a good number of sites, a good size of sites to show that you're going to be able to use this funding effectively. In this section, I stated what it was before, what it is now, and the plans for redevelopment, and included any related community plans that went back to this. I bolded anything that I thought an EPA reviewer might be drawn to, anything, you know, rooftop solar, green infrastructure, green space. If it was going to be a nonprofit use, anything related to climate change, those types of things that an EPA reviewer might especially be looking for. This is where you might want to think a little more aspirationally. What could it potentially include? This doesn't have to be definitive plans. You can be a little more aspirational on this, on what are the possibilities that it could be. In this section, I noted any site characteristics that corresponded with the EPA priorities that they noted in the request for application. Like last year, you got there was in the other factors checklist, there was something about being adjacent to a body of water. So I would note that if it was next to a body of water. I also noted anything that made the site special or might open up additional funding, like historic designations, and something that would show community need, like being in a severe distress community. And then finally, I noted any recognized environmental concerns, which is an EPA term for basically what are the documented or perceived environmental issues at the site. We're going to have some suggestions for this on the next slide related to past uses. For this, you know, use whatever information you have on the site already. Just keep in mind, you're asking for money to assess the site, so it's okay just to base this on current and past uses and not on actual data. All right, Danielle, would you like to go over some of the example recognized environmental concerns?
Sure, and I want to note here that in the definition of a brownfield, you don't actually have to have the contamination on site, but there needs to be a perception, at least, that there could be contamination. So the use of the property is really what drives that. And you can tell a lot from just the age of the building. For example, the buildings built before 1978, that ones, especially that have not yet been updated, are at risk for lead-based paint. Hazardous building materials like asbestos containing materials. Those are the 2 big ones. Mold is another one. The gas stations and auto repair facilities, if you're dealing with any kind of petroleum products or auto repair, you're going to be looking at petroleum contamination. Underground storage tanks, above ground storage tanks, things of that nature. You don't want to just say petroleum. You can be more specific. Common petroleum compounds are benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes. Lead is another big one that gets into the soil and into the groundwater. If there are any hydraulic lifts at a auto repair facility, you might even add some PCBs to that. Dry cleaners are notorious for your tetrachloroethylene and trichloroethylene, or the TCE and PCE. And these compounds are really hard to get rid of in the environment and are certainly a red flag if anything is a dry cleaner. Hospitals have really it all, and you'd be surprised by some of the things you can find in hospitals. There are x-ray rooms with lead walls. A lot of them built before 1980 have a lot of lead and asbestos, just being the size of those buildings. You're dealing with a potentially $1 to $2 to $3 million cleanup, mercury in the light switches and the thermostats, and also in the thermometers. If they were broken on the floor, you can sometimes find pooling of mercury under the floorboards when you start ripping apart those walls. So the more you know, if there's already been an assessment, refer to all of that. That would have already come out. But if there hasn't been an assessment and you just want to know more about the types of contamination that are associated with these types of properties, simple Google searches sometimes will come up with that. I'm sure that Rebecca would be happy to share her experience and her knowledge, as would I and anybody else at KSU, if you have any questions about what to expect for RECs. And also going back through some of those other grant applications that are available on the KSU website. They might have some other examples of what other people have included in some of the specific details that they have gotten into.
Yeah, that's definitely a good recommendation. I found some good tips going through those other proposals. And like Danielle mentioned, we're happy to help as well. If you know what your site was before, we can brainstorm with you. Another resource is LDEQ's Electronic Data Management System database. There's a link and how to access it, and next steps helpful links document, and you can look for old site records, previous reports, and that type of information there that can help you with this. Also, if you have an environmental consultant, they are often very helpful with this as well, and you can say, okay, this is what I've got. This is what we think it was before. What are some potential environmental concerns with that? They're more than happy to help you get funding to help address these sites. A question came in. Do you have to know and cite what we think a site could be? It is good. It is a more compelling case if someone came to you and asked for funding and said, we just want to clean up this site, but we don't know what we're doing, versus someone who comes to you and says, we want to clean up this site and this is the great redevelopment that we're going to do afterwards. Obviously, the second one is a more compelling case. So as much as you can, you want to paint that picture. Just keep in mind, Brownfield's very long time span. So a lot of times things change, plans change. It doesn't have to be definite. You're not tied down to that redevelopment plan, but just say it might not be what it could be. It might be what you hope it might be. Just include something related to the reuse of those sites. What are you hoping, or what are you planning on doing, or what would you like it to see down the line? So hopefully that helps. Okay. It's also helpful in this section to include the health effects of the environmental concerns that are noted above. Again, I'm a big fan of tables, so I put it in a table format. I note each recognized environmental concern that I noted in the priority sites table, the potential sources of that recognized environmental concern, and then its related health effects. For me, the table helps save space, so I'm not repeating this information for each site, and kind of brings it all together. I kind of went with the mentality, like, I feel like EPA reviewers should already know this, but this is something that they're specifically asking for. And this is something that's going to help you relate back to this in the community needs section to show how these health effects are affecting your population. I pulled these health effects from the OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and the Center for Disease Control's Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registries. So that's where this information came from. I recommend you just kind of use a search engine first. That might be a little bit easier. For instance, you can search for the health effects of lead. Just make sure that the information, again, from a reputable source, and make sure to cite that source in your document. Just a note on the health effects. Normally, this is a small subset of all the health effects from each one of these environmental concerns. I kind of cut them down just to save some space, but I made sure to keep any of the health effects that supported my overall proposal and then linked to information in other parts of the application. So for instance, I kept information anywhere that one of these said one of their health effects was cancer. I kept that, and then information in later sections, I included information on cancer rates and how that affects our sensitive populations. You know, if you have talk about women of childbearing age as one of your sensitive populations, you'll want to note if your environmental concern has the effect on the reproductive process. Or if you're noting later that children, which is another sensitive population in your area, have high lead levels in their blood and delayed mental abilities, you'll want to make sure to note in this section, you know, any of the environmental concerns like lead that can cause developmental delays. This is just one example of how to put together this information. Again, encourage you to look through the other examples of proposals on KSU's website for additional inspiration, and let us know if you need any help putting this together. Okay, so let's talk about some of the designations that I included and where to get information on them. So links to these resources are all in the Next Steps and Helpful Links document. If the priority site you're talking about is in an opportunity zone, you want to make sure to note that early and often. Opportunity zones were a priority for EPA in the last Brownfield RFA, and we're expecting that to be a priority again this year. And Louisiana Economic Development has a map of all the opportunity zones in Louisiana. So you can see if your target area and your site falls into one of those. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Opportunity Zones, it's a new community development program that was established by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. It's a tax incentive program designed to drive investments in low-income communities. So only low-income census tracts were eligible to be designated as opportunity zones. So that already shows the need of your target area. And it also highlights an additional potential funding resource for the assessment and cleanup and redevelopment of brownfield sites. It can also be helpful to note if your site is in a historic district or has a historic designation that would make it eligible for historic tax credits. The Louisiana Office of Cultural Development has a great map to find out if your site qualifies. And you can also use this information to add to the target area description, you know, noting how many historic sites are within your target area. So if you redevelop this one historic site, you know, these other historic properties might be revitalized as well. The Louisiana Office of Cultural Development also has a map of Louisiana cultural districts. In addition to being helpful and showing why your target area site is important, the applications that are submitted by the areas to request this designation can help provide some of that cultural flavor to help you tell the story of your community. And that's the same with the applications for the National Register districts. So this website has the map of those districts and then a list of them. If you want to find the actual application document, I recommend just doing a Google search with the name of the cultural district from the list along with cultural district application, and then it just popped right up. And then another option is enterprise zones, or the EZ program. It's a job incentives program that provides Louisiana tax credits to new or existing businesses in Louisiana that create permanent new full-time jobs and hire at least 50% of those jobs from one of the targeted groups. So people like residents who are living in an enterprise zone, people receiving public assistance, people who are lacking basic skills and education, and people who are unemployable by traditional standards. So this is a good one to note as it provides an additional incentive to facilitate the redevelopment and focuses on employing people that need additional help and may actually live in the target area. One note for the opportunity zones, historic tax credits, cultural districts, and enterprise zones, in addition to listing them here, you might also be able to include them in the leverage resources section part of the application that we're going to talk about either later on today or in the next webinar. So just kind of keep that in mind. You can put these in multiple sections. Last year, one of EPA's priorities was if the site was in a federal floodplain. So FEMA has a helpful website to find that information. Just in case it's a priority again this year, we've included a link to that page in the next steps and helpful links document. And then another resource for showing economic need is the Economic Innovation Group Severe Distressed Communities, which uses data to show which areas have recovered better or worse from the economic downturn a decade ago. This is example, it's shown by zip code. If you click on a polygon, it gives you additional information about the distress score. So darker red is more distressed. This is an example. I'm just kind of throwing this one out there to show you what kind of information might be out there. I found this through the Council of Development Finance Agencies. That's an organization I trust. I've worked with them before. I think they have a contract with EPA. And so since they were referencing this, I was comfortable in using this data and pulling this out and referencing this. So just kind of an example of what's out there. And then Danielle, would you like to talk about Opportunity Atlas?
Sure, and this is another one that we're just going to float out there. It's kind of thinking outside of some of the traditional boxes and traditional websites that you would go to. This one, full caveat, I have not actually used it yet, but I just discovered it, and it's around the premise of your zip code really defines and controls a lot about where you're going to go in life, especially if you grow up in a low-income census tract. And this Opportunity Atlas is a study that looks at ways or the impediments for children coming out of poverty. So this could add to your story, especially if persistent poverty is part of your story. You might find some really good information here. This website requires a little bit more investigation, a little bit more toggling between some of the parent incomes and the race and the gender. But if anything, it's a cool tool and some really interesting data coming out of that.
All right, great. Yeah, a lot of great resources out there. So those are just a few of the designations and resources available to help you tell your story. Other resources include you can contact state and local economic development agencies like the Delta Regional Authority. That's the map of how much of the state the Delta Regional Authority covers, so most parishes. You can contact them to see if they're aware of other designations or incentive programs for your target area and your priority sites. And we have links to the contacts for the DRA and local economic development districts in the next steps and helpful links document. One note with the economic development districts throughout the state, they put together what's called a comprehensive economic development strategy. I think it's every 3 or 4 years they put it together. It's basically a strategy plan for regional economic development, and it involves a good bit of community development. So it's helpful to note if there is a SEDS that includes your target area and sites, and if so, if it mentions brownfields. If it doesn't already, you might want to talk to them, to your economic development district folks, about including brownfield redevelopment and specific projects in future SEDS and future development strategies for future funding opportunities. You can also look through previous studies and plans for the target area or for specific sites, as well as other grant applications that can note other designations, districts, economic factors that might be helpful to include in your proposal. like for our LDEQ proposal, I borrowed a lot from the Monroe Coalition's Brownfield assessment proposal and the Shreveport Common plan that revitalization plan that they put together for that area, as those were two of our target areas. Obviously, they were both perfectly okay with me doing a lot of copying and pasting since it meant more resources for their respective communities. And we're also going to talk about other studies and plans to think about in the next section. All right, Danielle, would you like to do a little wrap up of this subsection?
Sure, just to wrap this up and hit on some of those kind of memorable notes, if you will. We're wanting to describe the brownfield sites in the target areas in this section. So this section is really about those specific sites. Highlighting one or more priority sites if you can. Putting in close to 3 or 4 would be great, but at least 1 or 2 priority sites. You can be crammed for space, so it depends on how many target areas you have. You want to include the past and current land use, current site conditions, potential environmental issues, and the health effects of those issues, tying those health effects into that community need that you're going to be talking about or already have. And then we want to understand the reuse plans, give EPA confidence that something great is going to come out of their money. And then discuss why the site is a priority for the assessment and reuse. So going back to those plans and those designations, why is this a priority? Again, you see a theme of everything needs to be tying together. You say something in one section, it should be carried through and reiterated in a different way in a different section. And how was the community involved? Like Rebecca said a while ago, EPA is really big on community involvement. Their input into the reuse, their input into the revitalization plans, their input into the whole process. They want to know this is publicly supported. It is, after all, public money. So how was the community involved in this process? It's really important.
All right, great. All right, so your next steps for this section, I know we threw a lot of information at you, a lot of different pieces and parts to put together. So to kind of break it down into next steps, you want to choose maybe 2 or 3 priority sites. If you're going for a coalition grant, you're obviously asking for my money, so you might want to go for 4 or 5 coalition grants and maybe have a few backups. Like I said, I started off with a few extras and then kind of saw which ones kind of had a more compelling story as I was writing the application. You want to gather data on each site to show the need and the resources for redevelopment. We're going to do a sample table on the next slide. Think about what are the environmental concerns related to those sites, and then research the health effects of the environmental concerns from your priority sites. So looking up through maybe OSHA or the CDC's, it's called ToxFacts. It has a list of for each contaminant and what are the toxic effects of those. So really great resource there. Okay, again, I love a good table. So here's an example of how to organize your information on your priority sites. You can add headers to the top of this to match up with some of the themes of your proposal. And some of this information, like proposed redevelopment strategy, we're going to talk about later on in your proposal. But I found having that information all in one place really helped me to track it all and then make sure that I was consistent throughout the proposal. This also helped me be able to evaluate the various sites and choose the priority sites, which ones looked better for what EPA was looking for, which ones had that more compelling case. Which ones could I weave into my story? Again, I probably started off with 10 priority sites and then whittled that down to 5, working with the best of combination into a cohesive narrative. All right, so time for another poll before we check in again about questions and answers. So what kind of brownfield sites are you looking to address? And you can choose all that apply. If you don't know yet, that's perfectly okay. You can just say, we don't know yet, but we're working on it. That's a good place to start. If there's other ones that aren't on this list, feel free to type those into the chat box. just kind of trying to get an idea of what folks plan on applying for. All right, I see Trey typed in tax adjudicated properties. Those are a good ones to focus on. Like we talked about in the last webinar, individual houses, if they're single family homes, aren't necessarily eligible, but if you do a group of tax adjudicated homes and then maybe have a plan to revitalize them for affordable housing, those can be a really great target area to focus on.
We'll cut it off here in a few seconds.
All right, go ahead and go back this way. All right, gas stations, always popular. There's gas stations everywhere that are abandoned. We have so many like little mom and pop stations in our neighborhoods that need to be addressed. Vacant historic buildings, those are also very popular throughout Louisiana. Industrial properties, abandoned manufacturing facilities, about a third for those, some for vacant houses. Empty lots, you gotta love an empty lot. There's always like, why is that lot empty? There's always a backstory. And normally when you start talking to people in the neighborhood, all the stories start coming out. Old hospitals, we have quite a few of those throughout the state. Closed school buildings, some of them are just so beautiful. It'd be great to see those restored. Some others, and then a few folks, about a third, we don't know yet, but we're working on it. Again, this is a great place to start and just get an idea of some of the information you're going to want to pull together when you apply for Brownfield funding. So really great spread of what folks are looking for. All right. So time for another pause for questions, stretch break. Let's see. Kimberly, did we answer your question? Just let us know if we need to elaborate on that. And I see from Adam, do you need some type of verbal or written understanding at this point that the property owner will allow access to the site for assessment work should the grant be awarded? Technically, it is not required. However, I don't really recommend putting it in here if the property owner really isn't on board. Just because if you do get awarded, normally EPA is fast and furious in sending out their press releases, and you just don't really want to catch anybody off guard. It's verbal is good at this point. If you have a written access agreement, you can actually note that in a later part of the application that we'll talk about later on. And that's a, kind of point in your favor if you already have an access agreement written. You just want to make sure that the expiration of that access agreement will cover past when this grant is going to start. Because remember, it's not going to start until October of 2021. But at least giving them a heads up, making sure that they're on board with being included in this. And it's a good time for you to just connect with them and market the Brownfield program and how it can help redevelop their site, which normally, once you get them comfortable with it, a lot of people appreciate the help with getting these properties moved forward.
Rebecca, to add on to that, you bring up a good point about, you don't want to catch somebody off guard. And a lot of times, even just the inventory that you say something is a brownfield site, you can really tick off some people. But in the regards to you don't technically, like Rebecca said, need to have permission. And in some cases, if a site has been identified as part of a bigger effort, say, classic example, a scrap metal yard. Scrap metal yards know that they're not an eyesore and that everybody wants them to be moved. And they might be in negotiations with the city or a developer to find another site or to be moved. So if it's part of a bigger revitalization plan, it has been identified, I think it's fair game.